In conversation with Kika Dorsey. Kika Dorsey is an author in Boulder, Colorado. She has a PhD in comparative literature, and her books include the poetry collection Beside Herself, Rust, Coming Off for Hair, Occupied. Vienna is a Broken Man and Daughter of Hunger, which won the Colorado Authors League Award for Best Poetry Collection. The novel, As Joan Approaches Infinity, and a recent collection of poetry, Good Hash, also a winner of Carl. She has been nominated numerous times for the Pushcart Prize and for Best of Net. Currently, she's a lecturer at the University of Colorado in literature and creative writing. In her free time, she swims smile in pools and run and hike in the open space of Colorado's mountain and plains. And on today's episode of Auto Interview, it's my utmost pleasure, excitement, and joy to have on the show today, Kika Dorsey. How are you doing today, Kika?
I'm doing well. It's Colorado is getting more autumnal and cool, and it's so nice being able to wear a jacket after a hot summer. So life here is good. Yeah, I'm doing well.
Yeah, it's lovely actually. It's actually gradually beginning to get stylishly cold as well in England. So, it's a blend of mixture and all of those things. Thank you very much. It's beautiful we are here to sit and have a conversation around your work. I want to say again, thank you for joining me today.
Happy to be
Yeah,
here.
absolutely. So, Kika, we are going to get into the nitty-gritty of what inspired you to write Good Hash. But then I'm impressed because you've been quite a writer for the past 30 years now, and you've published multiple titles aside from Good Hash, expanded on different genres to another. Now, I wanted to ask you, what is your first creative spark as a writer? What is that thing that fuels you in to write? That things that inspired you to write, to keep on going in this journey. I mean, it's been 30 years now. You've been writing for more than my life, here on earth, quite amazingly. If you can run us through the making of this book, actually, and why you chose this title, that'll be great.
Okay, those are a lot of questions, but I think
I
I can
know.
keep track of. I write a lot about relationship. I'm a feminist by heart, and one of the things that I learned studying feminist theory is that everything is relationship. And part of feminism, too, is about how our consciousness isn't about, I and other, it's about the relationship.
Yeah.
Um, and so I write a lot about relationships. I write about the body, embodied language. Um, and as far as, my poetry goes, it's gone through an evolution. When I wrote my first book, Rust, I was dealing with my mother who had Alzheimer's at the time and kind of writing about that grief. A lot of my poetry, honestly, is about grief. Good Ash, which came out recently, is a lot about my father's suicide. Well, not a lot, but there are poems about that. So I write about grief a lot and how that translates into the body and the experience of living life, right? Um, but my writing has gone through a lot of, evolutions. My novel, As Joan Approaches Infinity, which I can show you here, it's a great cover, um, is is about a very flawed character and it's a satire and it's very different than my poetry because it's a satire about a very addicted and flawed character who makes a lot of bad decisions.
Mm.
And it was a huge departure for me. So my evolution, as far as writing goes, it's gone to the poetry world of writing about grief in a way that's also, very pertinent to our time period. And Occupy was all about what happens
Mm,
in in a society that's based on racism, and
yeah.
what does that mean for the future of our country? I think it's very pertinent right now. And then,
Mm,
this satire that's, about this flawed character, and it's kind of funny. I mean, there are a lot of funny parts to it. So I feel like my writing through the years has gone through a lot of changes and
mm,
evolved. And I'm still doing different things with my writing. Some of the themes remain, but a lot of what I write is very different.
mm. Oh, wow. I must say that that is such an amazing answer you've provided and given, and that got me taking note, really. It's quite beautiful to know that most of your writing expand on the themes of grief. And, answering that wants me to ask you this new question that just popped up in my mind. How would you define poetry? What does poetry means to you personally as a poet? Because I think that I'm a poet as well, from one level of poet to another, everybody have their own divination of what they think of poetry. Maybe it's relieving, maybe it's more like a therapy or a guardian or a colleague or something to rely on during hard and sad times. But then I wanted to ask you, how would you define poetry? How do you find writing your work? What emotion do they leave you with? How do they make you feel afterward?
Yeah, those are great questions. I think poetry, honestly, it's a spiritual practice for me.
Absolutely,
I
I agree.
do most of it, yeah, I do most of it in the morning. I explore my dreams. I think of poetry as being like a way of connecting to the collective unconscious, and you're also individual unconscious, right? In your day-to-day life,
Yeah.
you are burying a lot of graves, whether you
Mm,
know it or not, right? And poetry is a way of resurrecting what has died. And it's a way of also coming to terms with emotions that you may not be able to process in the, world, the rational world that we live in. It's a way to explore also the body, the sensual experience. And this is kind of separate from that because
mm,
obviously you wake up, and if you're exploring a dream, it might not be embodied. But I think poetry, like a lot of poetry, is about just paying attention to the
yeah.
physical, natural world,
Mm,
and bringing that into your body and writing about that sensory experience. I love poetry. I mean, I'm
mm,
a poet at heart.
mm,
Even though I wrote one novel, my poetry and being a poet is a huge part of my identity. It's so important to me. And right now I'm teaching a poetry class at the
mm.
university. And I'm so excited about it. I'm like, oh, let's just talk about poetry because that is my passion.
Passion. I love your answer to that because I think it's very important and quite beautiful when you teach what you love passionately, or when you find yourself in a job you wholeheartedly love. I love literature and I'm excited to teach literature in a university. That's a beautiful one, really. And I love your definition of poetry. To me, I love to think of it and consider it the language of the heart, the language of the soul of the poet, and actually have a clocks to it. I would say poetry to me is a language of the soul of the writer at a particular time that the poem was written. Because sometimes the language in some instance may communicate happiness, excitement, merriment, joy, etc. And most of the time it may communicate at brokenness, misery, grief, pain, lamentation. That's why I love to put a clause of time. Because everything happens in different timing. Poetry is a language of the soul of the writer at that particular time that the poem is written. Because you can have one poet who has written on different extensive theme, exploring on different ones. And I must say, actually, I do love your divination. And I thought I'm gonna add mine.
It's interesting. Two things I'm going to say about that is yes, I think, and I tell my students that when they look at a poem that they've written, I say, what is the emotional resonance of that?
Mm,
Because a poem should have an emotional resonance. If it doesn't, then maybe you tried too hard to be formulaic or there's too much head in it or something, but it
yeah.
has like an emotional resonance. And I think, my poetry is definitely like it comes from my heart.
Absolutely. That's a beautiful one. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. And I wanted to ask you, you write both poetry and fiction. How do you balance the two? And do you ever, or do they ever influence each other in unexpected ways? I'm just curious about that. And also, as you're writing, both poetry and fiction shape the way you approach teaching and vice versa. Do your student or classroom experiences ever spark ideas in your creative work, if in any way? I'm just curious.
I have a lot to say about poetry versus
Mm,
fiction. That being said, I'll talk about it in my own relationship. I wrote a novel, and that novel was mostly a combination of short stories that turned into a novel. And my last book at the time of poetry was called Occupied, and it had these vignettes of characters that had gone through post World War II Germany and Austria. And I did a lot of research for it, and I created these characters.
mm,
That's how I got my job at CU because one of the professors saw that and said, you can teach fiction. So I started teaching fiction. I wrote that book and then I realized that poetry is unable to really delve into character development the
mm,
way, I mean, poetry is not, it's limited what you can do with character development. And
mm,
so I went into fiction thinking I want to create a character. And so I
mm,
had these short stories, wrote a novel, and it's very character based, which is my
mm.
favorite kind of fiction. But I have to say, like, writing fiction is painful for me. And I just wrote a novel of fiction. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get it published. It's very,
Wow.
my first book of fiction was a satire. It was funny. My
Mm,
second book, which is now being sent out to agents and stuff, it's more serious. It's more dark.
mm,
But once again, I'm exploring a character. So, my idea for me, the difference between writing poetry, which is more existential, more about my emotions, my moments, um, exploring dream and the
Yeah.
collective unconscious. And then my fiction is more about exploring a character.
Mm,
And I love that. I love delving into a character. It's much more painful for me
mm,
to write fiction, but I do enjoy it. And teaching fiction for me has been really enlightening because I'm reading these craft books and I'm teaching
mm,
students and I've been thinking about it a lot more. How do you do that? How do you integrate the strengths of poetry, like sensory details,
mm,
metaphors, all those figurative language techniques, and how do you integrate that also with story and
mm,
character development? It's very complicated. Um,
mm,
so I'm kind of at this point I'm on this tightrope between
mm,
fiction and poetry. I'm mostly a poet, but I love exploring a new craft, which is
mm. Mm. I must say that that's such a beautiful one you've mentioned there. An interesting one you've raised. Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing. Now, I wanted to ask you about your novel. Your novel, As Joan Approaches Infinity, explores motherhood, addiction, and identity with dark humor and deep honesty, which I found to be such an amazing and beautiful themes, actually. Now, I wanted to ask you, as you know, my curiosity wouldn't allow me, who is Joanne to you at our core? Let's start
Mm.
from there.
All right. So Joan is, there's a lot I can say about this because the foreword, who was written by Sarah Shantz, who's a friend of mine,
Mm,
she talks about how Joan is an unlikable character, and she compares it to other literature. I don't feel that Joan is unlikable. I feel like most people like her. But what I did, and all right, I'm going to be totally honest. Like at the time period that I was writing these short stories that turned into a novel, I
mm,
was managing the care of my demented mother. She had Alzheimer's. I was raising two children. I was overwhelmed. I was angry. It was a hard time period.
mm,
Um, and so I wrote these short stories of Joan, this kind of anti-hero who was totally dysfunctional, whereas I was functioning really well. Like,
wow.
you know, but I just made her act out. It was kind of a release for me in a lot of
Mm,
ways. And, she gets a DUI. She does all these crazy things to try to get a thrill out of her element of a pretty mundane life. She suffers from addiction, anxiety, and she's super impulsive.
mm,
She's like, I'm gonna go skydiving. I'm gonna like, swim to Alcatraz, and she just does all these things to try to make her life have meaning. And they're kind of pathetic, but you kind of relate to her. At one point she goes to Costco and buys all this food and she's like, screw this. I'm not going home. I'm just
mm,
gonna like drive to Wyoming and go to the hot springs and get away from my family, right?
mm,
So she's always trying to escape. And for me, it was very therapeutic considering I felt pretty trapped at the time. So I created this fictional,
mm,
woman who, and that's another thing. I mentioned that before. I'm a
mm,
feminist and she was taken for granted by her family. Like her family they don't care
mm,
about what
yeah.
she's thing. And yet
Mm,
she is running the whole household. She gets, a lot of pressure from her husband to make money. And she's like, how can I do that? I'm caring for the house and two
mm,
children and my demented mother. So, the book definitely explores that tension, and um I ended up loving Joan, and I think a lot of the writers did, despite that
wow.
forward. They, they sympathize with her, and she's
Mm,
very childlike. Like her decisions are so impulsive and so childlike and so immature in a way. And yet
mm.
she's doing the best she can.
Wow, that's an amazing description of Joanne. I love you talking about that. That's a beautiful one. And now I'm a bit curious to ask you, how did Joanne's story evolve for you? Was she always in your heart to be a particular center figure for you, or did she just emerge slowly over the time from your poetry, or maybe personal reflections? I'm just curious.
I think she was always in me. I mean, Joan was the
Mm,
part of me that I suppressed, and she was the impulsive person who did things that I wanted to do when I was, raising kids. And she was like my alter ego. That's a, she was
wow.
like my alter ego, right? She was my id. Um, and it took a while to develop her. I mean, there were years, it took 7 years of writing these short stories before it turned into a novel.
Wow. Wow. That's an amazing one, really. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you. Now, poetry seems to be at the heart of your creative life. What
Mhm.
does it mean to you on a personal level? I know we talked about the themes of grief initially, but then what does it mean to you on a personal level? And how has your relationship with poetry changed over the time?
That's hard to answer because poetry hasn't really changed for me.
Mm,
As far as what it's been to me, it's been an exploration of dream, my unconscious. It's
mm,
been, I guess the one way it has changed for me is I think it keeps getting more intimate for me.
mm,
For a while, I was interested in writing in form, and and I still do some of that, like, I don't know, write a sonnet, play with language. I still do
I love
that kind of,
that.
like I'm working on technique.
Mm,
But I think at heart, what it was and what it still is for me is an exploration of the intimacy of
mm,
self and other. And, and that other can be as simple as an apple tree. Like I'm
mm,
looking at an apple tree right now. I also I feel like with my poetry in the past, while I focused on technique and beauty, I think now, and you definitely see this in my not my book Good Ash,
yeah.
that it's very much about addressing you. I have a
Mm,
lot of you in there, I'll
mm,
reach out my experience of relationship, like embodying that. So I think in that sense, it's changed.
mm. I love your take on that as well. That's such a beautiful answer you've got in there. Thank you very much for sharing. And I wanted to ask you, just in case, apart from, Good Ash, and apart from your amazingly written novel, Joan's Approaches Infinity, do you have any other works you've authored or say currently working on? And if you have a copy of any of those books close by, I would like you to raise them to the camera.
I have other books. They're books of poetry. I don't have them now to show you unless I scramble back there. I can tell you about a book I'm working on right now, which
Yeah.
I'd love to talk about. It's called The Ledge, and it's, I'm kind of revising it again and again, and it's a novel. So in the last 2 years, I've focused mostly on my novel as opposed to my poetry. And it's about a 12-year-old girl who grows up with a schizophrenic father in Chicago in the 1970s. And I did a lot of research for it about 1975 and 1976 and I neighborhood that I decided she lives in. It's not funny. It's not like my satire. It's pretty dark. And unfortunately, it also doesn't really fit, literature. I've sent it out to agents so far. They can't figure out how they could market it. So I don't know if it's ever going to get published. I think it's a good book though, and I think I needed to write it. My father was a paranoid schizophrenic, what they
Mm.
called paranoid schizophrenia at the time. They say now it's bipolar disorder with
Disorder.
schizoaffective
Mm.
tendencies or whatever. But but he was crazy. So I totally know what it means to grow up as a child with a, severely mentally ill parent.
Mm.
And that has been my project, over the summer. I've spent 2 years focusing on this novel, and I don't know what's going to come of it. I
Mm.
hope I can publish it.
That's a great one. That's an amazing one, really. I hope that goes on successfully and well enough. Now, just in case we have some viewers who are watching this interview and would love to get a copy of any of your books, on what platforms can they find them?
You can get all my books on Amazon. Good Ash is also Pinion Publishing, which
Mm.
I'm a big believer of avoiding Amazon and going to the publisher.
Yeah.
So Good Ash occupied about post-war Europe. And then other Goodrich, is so supportive. We're actually re-releasing it, and I'm going to write an intro to kind of give people an idea of where it came from, which I've talked about in this interview.
Mm.
But yeah, Gesture Press, is the place to order that. But either way, all my books you can find on Amazon.
Interesting. That's amazing. And I left a link in the description part of this interview where interested viewers can get a copy of Kika Dorsey books directly on Amazon, on our website, on the publisher's website, and also on other platforms. I also left a link to Kika's social media pages for possible followings. So I want to say thank you very much, Kika, for sitting down with me today to have this beautiful conversation around your amazing body of literature work. And also, this is more than awesome, so exciting, so beautiful, so great. And I'm very excited to have discovered your writings. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's my pleasure as well.